are you prepared? First, I want to thank you for your patience and for coming down to DC for a very, very important demonstration. And welcome to Inaugurate The Resistance. My name is L.J. Hawkins. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative, one of the co-sponsors of this event. And as you can see, we have a very distinguished group of thinkers, of activists, organizers on the stage. I'll just give a few opening remarks before we get to the meat of this event. As we prepare to go back home, we have to figure out a way, how do we organize and mobilize and agitate now that we will be leaving DC and beginning the Trump presidency. This struggle is not just about Donald Trump, but in fact, this is a struggle against the oligarchs of Wall Street and the system of capitalism and all that it breeds: racism, poverty, war, and environmental destruction. I'm reminded that this year is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's Why I Oppose the Vietnam War. And in that speech, he did something that was very significant. He, in many ways, created a marriage between the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement that was crucial in the defeat of U.S. imperialism in Vietnam and bringing home the troops and tying the struggle against war abroad and the war at home and the question of poverty and income inequality and civil rights. Today, we are faced now with a very grotesque version of neoliberal capitalism under Donald Trump. And I certainly won't be calling him president. I'll call him what his mama called him, Donald. How do we build our mass movements, and what do they look like? Today, you will hear folks that will give you prime examples of the work in Seattle of Sharma Sawant, the Socialist City Councilor. You will hear the analysis of Chris Hedges, raising the question and the specter of how dangerous this administration is and how do we engage in a fight back. The questions of, do we reform the Democratic Party, or do we begin a process of building our own political party of the working class and poor and the most oppressed? And ultimately, how do we build a resistance movement that at its core is rooted among the working class and the poor, not just in DC, but in every enclave of American society, in our cities, in our suburbs, in our urban centers, in our universities, in our workplace, among our unions and among our social justice and civic organizations, and even in our churches? And how do we build a bridge to those who voted for Trump, many of them the victims of neoliberal capitalism, who are itching for some change? We must create a wall of resistance and a powerful bridge where we can reach out our hands to them and say, our enemy is not the immigrant or the low-wage worker or the LGBTQAI person. Our enemy sits at one Wall Street. They're the ones who have the corporate lobbyists who bought off both political parties, Democrats and Republicans. The enemy is the one that's sending bombs to displace and dispossess working people and the poor of this planet. They're the ones that are fracking the land, and in many ways violating the land, sacred land. So today, I thank you for coming out. We will begin our program. Let's get ready. Let's prepare ourselves, because when we go back home, the real work begins.
So we are going to start with the analysis of Chris Hodges. My name is Darryl Moak, and I am one of the national co-chairs of the U.S. Green Party, and also the chair of the D.C. Statehood Green Party. And so we are honored to be able to host you here in our great state of Douglas Commonwealth, also sometimes known as New Columbia. We are proud to have you here with us. We're proud to have you march with us. We are proud to stand with you and beside you as we continue to make sure that this nation that we live in and the world that we live in is exactly what we need and want it to be. And so we are glad to be a part of this with you, as is the U.S. Green Party, glad to be a part of this process and to work with you and to stand with you. We're going to begin by introducing to you Chris Hedges. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of several New York Times bestsellers. He is a columnist for the website Truth Dig and the host of On Contact with RT. Chris?
The ruling elites, terrified by the mobilization of the left in the 1960s, or by what Samuel Huntington called America's excess of democracy, built counter-institutions to delegitimize and marginalize critics of corporate capitalism and imperialism. They bought the allegiances of the two main political parties. They imposed ideological obedience to the neoliberal agenda within academia and the press. This campaign, laid out by Lewis Powell in his 1971 memorandum, Attack on American Free Enterprise System, was the blueprint for the creeping corporate coup d'etat that 45 years later is complete. The destruction of democratic institutions, places where the citizen has agency and a voice, is far graver than the ascendancy to the White House of the demagogue Donald Trump. The coup destroyed our two-party system. It destroyed labor unions. It destroyed public education. It destroyed the judiciary. It destroyed the press. It destroyed academia. It destroyed consumer and environmental protection. It destroyed our industrial base. It destroyed communities and cities. And it has destroyed the lives of tens of millions of Americans, no longer able to find work that provides a living wage, cursed to live in chronic poverty, or locked in cages in our monstrous system of mass incarceration. This coup has also destroyed the credibility of liberal democracy. Self-identified liberals, such as the Clintons or Barack Obama, mouthed the words of liberal democratic values while making war on those values in the service of corporate power. The revolt we see rippling across the country is a revolt not only against a corporate system that has betrayed workers, but also, for many, liberal democracy itself. This is very dangerous. It will allow the radical right under a Trump administration to rapidly cement into place an Americanized fascism. Ignorance allied with power, James Baldwin wrote, is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. It turns out 45 years later that those who truly hate us for our freedoms are not the array of dehumanized enemies cooked up by the war machine, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Afghans, Iraqis, Iranians, or even the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. They are the financiers, bankers, politicians, public intellectuals and pundits, lawyers, journalists, and business people, cultivated in the elite universities and business schools, who sold us the utopian dream of neoliberalism. We are entering the twilight phase of capitalism. Wealth is no longer created by producing or manufacturing. It is created by manipulating the prices of stocks and commodities and imposing a crippling debt peonage on the public. Our casino capitalism has merged with the gambling industry. The entire system is parasitic. It is designed to prey on the desperate, students burdened by loans, underpaid workers, burdened by credit card debt and mortgages, towns and cities forced to borrow to maintain municipal services. Casino magnates such as Sheldon Adelson and hedge fund managers such as Robert Mercer add nothing of value to society. They do not generate money, but redistribute it upwards to the 1%. They use lobbyists and campaign contributions to build monopolies. This is how the drug company Mylan raised the price of the EpiPen used to treat allergy reactions from $57 in 2007 to $500. To rewrite the laws and regulations, they have given themselves the legal power to carry out a tax boycott, loot the US Treasury, close factories, send jobs overseas, gut social service programs, and impose austerity. They have at the same time militarized our police, built the most sophisticated security and surveillance apparatus in human history, and taken from us our civil liberties by judicial fiat. They are ready, should we rise up in defiance. These mandarins are, if we speak in the language of God and country, traitors. They are parasites. Financial speculation in 17th century England was a crime. Speculators were hanged. The heads of most of the banks and hedge funds, the executives of large corporations such as Walmart and Gap that run sweatshop death traps for impoverished workers overseas, deserve prison far more than most of the poor students of color who never had a fair chance in life and who I teach within our prison system. When a tiny cabal seizes power, monarchist, communist, fascist, or corporate, it creates a mafia economy and a mafia state. Donald Trump is not an anomaly. He is the grotesque visage of a collapsed democracy. Trump and his coterie of billionaires, generals, half-wits, Christian fascists, criminals, racists, and deviants play the role of William Faulkner's Snopes clan. The Snopeses in Faulkner's novels ruthlessly seized control from the degenerated former slave-holding aristocratic elites. Flem Snopes and his extended family, which included a killer, a pedophile, a bigamist, an arsonist, a mentally disabled man who copulates with a cow, and a relative who sells tickets to witness the bestiality, are fictional representations of the scum now elevated to the highest level of the federal government. They embody the moral rot unleashed by decay and unfettered capitalism. The usual reference to amorality, while accurate, is not sufficiently distinctive and by itself does not allow us to place them, as they should be placed, in a historical moment. The critic Irving Howe wrote of the Snopeses. Perhaps the most important thing to be said is that they are what comes afterwards, the creatures that emerge from the devastation with the slime still upon their lips. Let a world collapse in the South or Russia, and there appear figures of coarse ambition, driving their way up from beneath the social bottom, men to whom moral claims are not so much as absurd as incomprehensible, sons of bushwhackers and musics drifting in from nowhere and taking over through the sheer outrageousness of their monolithic force. They become presidents of local banks and chairmen of party regional committees, and later, a trifle slicked up, they muscle their way into Congress or the Politburo. Scavengers without inhibition. They need not believe in the crumbling official code of their society. They need only learn to mimic its sounds. What comes next, history has shown, will not be pleasant. A corrupt and inept ruling elite, backed by the organs of state security and law enforcement, will unleash a naked kleptocracy. Workers will become serfs. The most benign dissent will be criminalized. The ravaging of the ecosystem will propel us towards extinction. Hate talk will call for attacks against Muslims, undocumented workers, African Americans, feminists, intellectuals, artists, dissidents, who will be scapegoated for the country's stagnation. Magical thinking will dominate our airwaves and be taught in our public schools. Art and culture will be degraded to nationalist kitsch. All the cultural and intellectual disciplines that allow us to view the world from the perspective of the other, that foster empathy, understanding, and compassion, will be replaced by a grotesque and cruel hypermasculinity and hypermilitarism. Racism, bigotry, misogyny, and homophobia will be validated by those in power. Our only hope now is an unwavering non-cooperation with the systems of corporate control. We must rebuild new democratic institutions from the ground up. We must not be seduced into trusting the power elites, including the Democratic Party, with 7 leading candidates to be the next chair of the Democratic National Committee demonstrated the other night at George Washington University that they have no interest in defying corporate power or backing democratic populism. And we must also acknowledge our own failures on the left, our elitism, arrogance, and refusal to root our politics in local communities. Rosa Luxemburg understood that unless we first address the most pressing economic and physical needs of the destitute, we will never gain credibility or build a resistance movement. Revolt, she said, is achieved only by establishing genuine relationships with the oppressed, including with people who do not think like us. Successful revolt surges up from below. Politics is a game of fear. Those who do not make power elites afraid do not succeed. All the movements that opened up the democratic space in America, the abolitionists, suffragists, communists, socialists, anarchists, and the labor and civil rights movements, developed a critical mass and militancy that forced the centers of power to respond. The platitudes about justice, equality, and democracy are just that. Only when power is threatened does it react. Appealing to its better nature is useless. It doesn't have one. We once had within our capitalist democracy liberal institutions, the press, labor unions, third parties, civic and church groups, public broadcasting, well-funded public universities, and a liberal wing of the Democratic Party that were capable of responding to outside pressure from movements. They did so imperfectly. They provided only enough reforms to save the capitalist system from widespread unrest or with a breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s from revolution. They never addressed white supremacy and institutional racism or the cruelty that is endemic to capitalism. But they had the ability to ameliorate the suffering of working men and women. This safety valve no longer works, and when reform becomes impossible, revolution becomes inevitable. The days ahead will be dark and frightening, but as Immanuel Kant reminded us, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. We fight for the sacred. We fight for life. It is a fight we must not lose. To be a bystander is to be complicit in radical evil.
Tell it.
Revolt is a political necessity. It is a moral imperative. It is a defense of the sacred, and it alone makes hope possible. The moment we defy power, we are victorious. The moment we stand alongside the oppressed and accept being treated like the oppressed, we are victorious. The moment we hold up a flickering light in the darkness for others to see, we are victorious. The moment we thwart the building of a pipeline or a fracking site, we are victorious. And the moment those in power become frightened of us, we are victorious. I do not know if we can build a better society. I do not even know if we will survive as a species. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you.
I'm a healthcare worker, and in times like this, where there's something wrong with the body and you go to the doctor, you need someone to give you a right diagnosis and provide a prescription or some holistic medicine to heal the body. So, what we have in the house is a medical doctor who is now a practicing political medicine doctor. She was the Green Party nominee for president. In 2012 and 2016, I bring to you Dr. Jill Stein.
Well, thank you for standing up in order to unite and to fight, which is what we have to do right now. So I would say welcome to the resistance. But for most of you, you've already been here. This is not new. This is just building on what has been, kind of in the cards for quite some time. And as awful, despicable, scary as this moment is, at least the veil has come off. And, whether we were heading for a slow demise, being strangled by neoliberalism under the Democratic Party, or whether we are actually engaging the battle right now, facing this neo-fascist administration, we were kind of going to the same place. So, I personally, I find this a sobering moment, but, am not feeling surprised. In fact, I'm actually a little bit surprised that there is as much clarity and as much resistance on the streets here at ground zero of the new, era of the billionaire takeover. I've been very pleasantly surprised, I have to say, just being out on the streets, that people are not saying, at least where I've been, which was largely around Franklin Park yesterday. I was not on the street today because we were doing a broadcast of sort of local resistance on the Green News Network, so I was actually not out there in the Women's March. But from what I saw yesterday, it really felt there was such a hunger out on the streets for discussion and for talk and for just really kind of soul searching about where do we go from here. And I was really delighted not to hear, well, we just got to work harder and get back with the Democratic Party and that's the solution. People are really recognizing that Donald Trump really is a symbol of this predatory, bipartisan political system brought to us by predatory banks and fossil fuel giants and war profiteers, Donald Trump is the face of that bipartisan system. And we must reject not just Donald Trump and the Republicans, we must also reject the Democrats as well. And I am encouraged by, by this massive march today, by yesterday's resistance, by the walkouts from high schools and colleges across the country, by the strike of the longshoremen on the West Coast, which needs to be a symbol for us all, and I think a tactic we are going to be expanding on. Very, lifted up and encouraged by the fight of the indigenous leaders at Standing Rock, and the many fights that are following in suit against the pipelines in Memphis, in Texas, in really all around the country, that on so many fronts people are standing up for nothing short, of an America and a world that works for all of us. I think we have seen that the piecemeal solutions, the window dressing on a burning house, is not what unifies people, is not what brings us out, is not what engages people in struggle. We need to be really standing up for a transformative agenda that puts people, planet, and peace over profit, and nothing less than that. This election, I think, was no surprise, an incredibly toxic election, which had a very toxic consequence. More degraded by big money and corporate profiteering in terms of media coverage, billions of dollars worth of free media delivered particularly to Donald Trump, with the approval and encouragement of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, that was lifting up Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and looking to make the Republican candidate as fringe and lunatic as possible in order to help Hillary's chances. This was an extremely corrupt election, which was the product of corrupt politics and corrupt media, and it produced the most disliked, untrusted candidates for president among the mainstream parties in our history. So this was not a Republican triumph, it was a bipartisan failure. The majority of Donald Trump's voters were not voting for Donald Trump. This was shown in poll after poll. Donald Trump's voters were largely voting against Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party and their track record for bailing out Wall Street, not only bailing out Wall Street, but dismantling Wall Street regulation to start with, and exporting our jobs and creating wars without end that are blowing back at us. At the same time, they are depleting our budget, costing us half of our discretionary budget for these wars that have only created failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats. So people were saying, we've had enough, we are rejecting both of these corrupt corporate parties. 80% of people said that they were disgusted by this election. 90% registered in a poll last spring in the midst of the election, saying 90% saying they had lost faith in our political system, in the executive, in Congress, in the judiciary, really across the board. We have had a massive rejection and repudiation of this political system. 75% of people were screaming for other alternatives in this election and were calling for open debates, which is why part of the struggle going forward is to have a People's Debate Commission and end this corporate-controlled, bipartisan scam of a debate. And 60% of people have been calling for a new major political party, and it's long past time to do that. And as well, so many people who were yearning for something else, but who were intimidated by being terrified of either Hillary Clinton, because a lot of people have had it with the Democrats, or they were terrified by Donald Trump and the reality of what he represents. So we had a system in which the main question on people's minds in going to the polls was, who do you hate the most? And who are you most afraid of? And guess what? The politics of fear delivered everything we were afraid of. We need a new politics of courage going forward, and we need a voting system that actually liberates us to vote our values and not to feel constrained by our fears. We need ranked choice voting. And the state of Maine actually passed ranked choice voting, which really charts the course for us all. We can all pass ranked choice voting in every state. It doesn't require congressional legislation, and it can be done with a voter referendum, which is how it was done in Maine, because the Democratic and Republican-controlled legislatures are never going to let it out of the bag. In fact, in California, Jerry Brown recently vetoed a bill that would have allowed ranked choice voting at the municipal level. And why don't they want it? Because it would actually force their hand. They would have to fish or cut bait. They would actually have to stand up for what they're for, instead of just being slightly less worse than the Republicans. They would actually have to engage in a real debate. And the reality is, they don't support us. They do not support a progressive agenda. And ranked choice voting really calls their bluff. They will not support it because they basically do not support us, the voters. And in my view, the fact that the Democratic Party has consistently fought against ranked choice voting says that they do not support us and they do not deserve your vote on that basis alone. Trump's rise to power is clearly the product of economic despair caused by the neoliberal policies of both parties. And those policies that gave us these lousy, part-time, insecure, low-wage jobs. Anybody familiar with those kinds of jobs out there? This is like 90% of the jobs that have been created since the Wall Street crash are these low-wage jobs. So people who are new in the job market, that is millennials, are really getting the short end of the stick here, which is why you don't have to be persuaded, that the system is corrupt. The challenge with millennials is to just let you know that there is another option out there that actually stands up for what you need in order to survive. It's not only the jobs, it's the poverty level wages. It's that generation of young people locked into predatory student loan debt without a way out. And by the way, the number of young people locked into student loan debt alone is enough to win a three-way presidential race, or a three-way race at our local levels and for legislatures and so on. And student debt is not just a national issue. It is a local and a state issue. And anyone running for office at that local or state level can actually be an advocate to your state legislature, to your college system, to reduce the costs of student fees and tuition right now, so that we can actually run campaigns locally based on this same agenda, which have the same potential to really capture majoritarian support here. And because you're running at a local level, it is more possible to actually knock on doors, mobilize people, and to actually win these races. And I'll come back to that in a moment about where we go from here. But just to make the point that the rise of Donald Trump, yes, it has everything to do with racism and misogyny and xenophobia and all of that. But it's in times of great economic crisis that we see the dark side rising up, and we see demagogues who play us on our fears. So it's really important, I think, for us to stand up to address that crisis that has forced people to their backs against the wall, to where we are essentially engaging in blaming the victim right now. This didn't come out of nowhere. This comes very much out of the economic crisis, which we can very much lay at the feet of the Democrats every bit as much as the Republicans here. The Democrats are every bit as culpable. So, I'm basically driving home that the response here, the real effective response, is not cleaving to the Democrats as the voice of opposition or as the alternative here. We are the alternative, independent, people-powered politics under the likes of the Green Party and the Socialist Alternative. It is we, independent political parties, that are not corporate-sponsored, that are actually engaged right now at the local level, as Shama Sawant is, as Gail McLaughlin has been in Richmond, California, where they've also done really amazing and wonderful things. This is what you're not supposed to know about, because if you know about this, then we don't sit quiet and allow ourselves to be sidelined. And I'll just mention, back in 2002, the first time I ran for office against Mitt Romney, running for governor in Massachusetts, we fought our way into a televised debate. It took place in a TV studio, no live audience, and by giving voice to this radical progressive agenda, at that time, when things weren't as bad as they are right now, inside the TV studio, it went over like a lead balloon. But when I walked out of the TV studio, I was mobbed by the press, who told me that I had won the debate on the instant online viewer poll. And it, in a flash, made me realize we're actually not the odd man out here. We actually are the heart and soul of American values, which are to say human values, people values, workers' values, women's values. That's who we are. And the corporate media and our corporate political parties may try to tell us otherwise, but that's just not the case. So it's important, I think, for us to go forward from a position of strength, not from a position of apology that we are asking too much, or that aren't we being presumptuous by thinking that students should be bailed out. It's only the Wall Street bankers who get bailed out, but not a generation of young people who are the victims of Wall Street. That's absolute nonsense. It's time for us to bail out the students. We can afford to do that. We can afford it for Wall Street. We can afford it for young people. Great, okay. So let me just conclude here by saying that this is a presidency, whether to even call it legitimate or illegitimate, shall we say there are problems with our voting system, which are long-standing, and no less in this election, but certainly this president violates our basic tenets of our Constitution, our civil liberties, our civil rights, our basic sense of justice, the War Powers Act, etc., the right of the legislature to declare war, and so on. This president stands in violation of our basic principles, our ethics guidelines, our laws around conflicts of interest. This president enters his administration with a playing field very steeply tilted against him. That's not to say he isn't capable of sending us all to oblivion, with the flick of a switch. He is, but at the same time, it's important to remember how incredibly embattled this president is. His support ratings are going down by the hour. He's absolutely unprepared and unequipped to do this job. As of yesterday, they had appointed all of 29 people among the 600 executive appointments that they have to make. They don't have a clue, not even how to run a modern business or to sit on a board of directors, which they do not have. This is a sort of a family mafia running a family business, or call them an aristocracy or whatever they are. They are not capable of even administering our state. As compromised as it is, they are not up to the job. And they are going to continue failing madly, embarrassing themselves embarrassing all of us in the world community. So they are going to be very hamstrung, there's no doubt about it, in legal challenges, constitutional challenges. This is an impeachment waiting to happen. And remember, whether there's an impeachment or not, corrupt governments have been brought down, and they've also been brought to heel. Many of us here will remember what happened under Richard Nixon, one of the most corrupt and regressive, repressive presidents in our history. We brought the troops home from Vietnam. We created the EPA. We passed the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. We achieved women's right to choose from a very conservative Supreme Court. We created OSHA for occupational safety and health, protection of workers. All of this we did under an extremely repressive and violent regime. We did that because, why? Our lives were on the line. Our brothers, particularly our brothers of color, but young people as well, were being sent to die in Vietnam. Well, our lives are on the line again. And whether it's from, the violence against African Americans, the pending deportations of immigrants, whether it is a generation locked in debt without a future, or the meltdown of the climate, which is happening on our watch in our lifetimes, with latest climate science saying maybe we have a couple of decades before we see tens of feet of sea level rise, absolutely unsustainable for civilization as we know it. Our lives are on the line. That's extremely motivating. We have the numbers, we have the solutions, we have the power. It's time to get organized. When we stand up with the power that we do have, we can create an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. This is the time to get organized around the issues, to get organized in our communities, and to get organized fundamentally, politically, because that's where we come together to achieve critical mass, to say no to the divide and conquer regimen that they're trying to force on us, to have us work on our favorite issue alone, in which we will all be divided and conquered. A political party that is a real political party is essentially a coalition over time, over issues, over geography, with a clear agenda. We have that agenda. It's an agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit. It is not an agenda of window dressing, of marginal changes around a crisis. We have a crisis. The world is going up in flames, and we are in the middle of it. But we have the numbers that it takes, and we have the vision and the passion to do it. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Let's make it happen. Thank you so much.
We are going to hear from Tim Canova now. Tim, did I pronounce it right? Yeah, awesome. Tim is a law professor in Florida. He ran last year against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the Democratic primary, and now heads Progress for All. Please welcome Tim.
Yesterday was actually a wonderful day for me and for those who I rallied with and we marched with. We didn't get to see the inauguration at all. Maybe that's what made it such a special, wonderful day for us. But it really was special to be able to share time with folks in this movement. And I say it's a movement consisting of many movements that are all coalescing today. And I think you saw this in the election year that just passed, that the movement keeps growing. There's a tendency, I think, to look at the outcome of this election and just look only on the downside of it. And it's easy to do that, of course. The two choices for the presidency in November were, they were two evils that we were forced to choose among. And yet, I think it's important to look at the events of the last year and count our blessings that people are waking up, and they're waking up fast. We are up against very entrenched power in this country, in both political parties. As Dr. Stein mentioned, of course, the Democratic Party has become a corporate-controlled party. And I respect those who are trying to change from outside of the party. You're looking at somebody who was a Democrat for many years. I got so disgusted I registered non-party affiliation for 3 years. And last year really changed a lot for me and for a lot of folks in this country. And it was the issues that got me re-engaged in the Democratic Party and trying to reform the party from within. And I certainly don't feel alone in that task. There was an army of folks around this country who were caught up in Bernie Sanders' campaign, and it made a big difference in getting me to stand up. I'm a law professor, and for many years, I was publishing articles and book chapters critical of the direction of this country, the neoliberal agenda, the Washington Wall Street consensus, and it was very unpopular to do so for many years. And the 2008 financial collapse starts to open a window, you can say. But the movement we saw in the last year didn't just start with Bernie Sanders at all. You know, I look back 20 years ago almost, the spirit of Seattle in 1999, when 50,000 people descended on the city of Seattle to protest the World Trade Organization. You know, the neoliberal movement agenda kept moving forward, but every step of the way, people were waking up and protesting. And, you know, for 2 years after the spirit of Seattle, that protest movement grew all over the world. I remember it was being referred to as a global stalking movement. Wherever the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, or the G8 were meeting, there were bigger and bigger demonstrations. By the summer of 2001, we're talking about in Genoa, Italy, I think 1 million people. You know, all over the world this was happening. Now, September 11th literally brought that protest period to an end. I remember late September of 2001, there was scheduled International Monetary Fund and World Bank annual meetings in Washington, D.C. And we were all bracing, some of us were looking forward to it greatly, the protests that were going to take place there. And those protests fizzled out before they started, and a lot of it was the fear and the shock of September 11th. But the movement didn't go away. I think it gets beaten down, but it's still there. And the bubble kept growing in this economy, the hypocrisy kept growing, and in 2008 it comes crashing down. And a couple of years later, you see a reaction on both the right and the left. On the right, the Tea Party before it gets co-opted by corporate interests. On the left, the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I shouldn't even say it's a left movement. I was a professor in Southern California at the time, and I took part in Occupy Los Angeles, a very small role. But I'll tell you, it was a lot of millennials, it was baby boomers, it was people who were flattened out, hit hard, knocked to the ground by that financial crisis. And they saw a government that was stepping in quickly to help Wall Street. You know, the Federal Reserve in just the first 2 years after the crisis made $29 trillion in near zero interest loans to Wall Street banks. So it was a trickle-down approach, even during the Obama administration, by all the main organs of the state and the Federal Reserve. All the main organs stepped in to bail out those who had created the crisis. So failure was rewarded. And there was a backlash. It was the Occupy movement. And the Occupy movement gets swept off the streets, but the pain doesn't go away, the crisis doesn't go away, the contradictions don't go away. And Bernie Sanders started waking folks up to the idea that you can actually try to change the system through the electoral process. Now, there are lots of reasons to roll your eyes now and say, no, the electoral process is a failure. Well, it hasn't worked yet, but obviously we have to work through the electoral system and around the electoral system, through the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party. So I was a professor, you know, in obscurity when I saw the Sanders campaign, and I saw that it was my local congresswoman who headed the DNC and was trying to put her finger down there on the scales in a big way to prevent the Sanders campaign. And you know, he was calling for political revolution, and I thought, if this man in his 70s is taking the fight to the Clinton machine, I'll take the fight to my local congresswoman. Maybe you should have run as a Green. The Greens didn't have a candidate there. And I wanted to make a statement. I wanted to challenge her in a Democratic primary and strip the bark off the tree and let folks see what kind of not just a DNC chairman she was, but the kind of corporate Democrat she was. Because so many Democrats, you know, they talk the talk, but behind the scenes, they're taking a lot of corporate cash, and she was the epitome of what the problem was. So I made a pledge at the beginning I wouldn't take a dime from any corporate interests, And I had some folks saying, no, you got to sit down and spend 20 or 30 hours a week like anyone else, take your medicine, get on the phone and do your call time 30 hours a week, dialing for dollars. And I laughed at it. I said, no, we are staying true to this principle. And we were lifted on the shoulders of the grassroots movement in this country. We were rewarded for renouncing corporate money, because on issue after issue, the people of this country are so far ahead of the establishment parties, whether they're people working through the Green Party or people who are still trying to work through the Democratic Party, like me. And we broke all kinds of fundraising records for a congressional campaign for small online donations. 200,000 times somebody in this country clicked on their mouse and donated $17 on average to this campaign. We stayed true to the vision of making a grassroots campaign. You know, Bernie Sanders in all of South Florida had one field office. We had 4 field offices in my district alone. At the height of the campaign, we had hundreds of volunteers and field organizers knocking on doors of all ages in the Florida heat, in the summertime, knocking on 10,000 doors a week. And these weren't folks just leaving literature. These were folks talking about the issues. That's where you got to meet the voters, and that's where this movement gets back up off the ground, organizing and mobilizing on the issues. Now, we fell short. 8 months is not a long time to run against somebody who's established like Wasserman Schultz was. You know, I got some folks saying you should have jumped in sooner. Well, sure, I should have. I did have a full-time job that was getting in the way of that. But in 8 months, we scared the daylights out of her, we got the nation's attention, and we highlighted some very important issues. Again, those issues haven't gone away. So since the election, we've started a group called Progress for All. And that was the campaign slogan. It is what embodies the New Deal, the idea that it's not progressive if everyone's not included. Great tradition in the Democratic Party that has to be reawakened. Now, I know somebody, Mr. Hedges, had said that he watched the Huffington Post debate the other night of the DNC candidates for the chair, and that not one of them denounced corporate money. That's not actually true. I watched that debate. Sally Boynton Brown, she deserves a round of applause for her answer. And I'll tell you what the question was. You know, in 2008, Barack Obama banned corporate lobbyist donations from the DNC. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz overturned that ban in 2015. And since then, the DNC and the Democratic Party has been awash in cash. You saw it recently with this prescription drug vote. Okay, Cory Booker may have destroyed his presidential ambitions.
Good.
Okay, $400,000 he's taken from Big Pharma, and he votes against giving the consumer a choice in purchasing prescription drugs. So the candidates the other night were asked, would you reimpose that ban on corporate lobbyist donations? And Sally Boynton Brown did not equivocate. She said, we must ban that money now, and will be rewarded by the grassroots in small donations. Now, that is exactly what happened in my campaign. And that's what the Democratic Party has to do. One of the other candidates said, you know, this holier-than-thou attitude is not helpful. Well, I'll tell you, not only is it helpful, it is absolutely necessary. Anyone who's going to be engaged in the Democratic Party right now, that is the litmus test. And, you know, it's not just because, you know, we want to act like we're pure. It's because we know that those corporate dollars are influencing votes and positions of candidates. Okay, I've got to wrap this up real soon. Let me just say that at Progress for All, again, we want to organize and mobilize on the issues. And I want to just give a shout out for some of these issues that are animating right now, and it's happening all over the country. We've got a pipeline in Florida called the Sable Trail Pipeline. I've been calling it the Sable Trail Sinkhole Pipeline. Every state in this country just about has a Dakota Access Pipeline right now. This is the model that the corporations have, which is to privatize everything they can. David Cobb talked about, you know, the enclosure of the commons. That's exactly what's happening. Public education, health, the water now. I remember 20 years ago when I was railing against the IMF and World Bank, and it was water being privatized in third world countries, and laws that were being passed to criminalize the collecting of rainwater. Well, we don't have to look at third world countries now. In this country, our water is at stake. And I know it because in Florida, we're on the front lines. Climate change is a real thing. The millennial generation knows it, and that's why they don't have the patience to wait and the patience for a choice between climate deniers and climate hypocrisy. Okay? And we've got to ban fracking. We've got to stop these pipelines. The problem, of course, right now, at this moment in time, is that you look at state legislatures or you look at Congress and you don't have the votes to ban fracking and you don't have the votes to stop pipelines. But the movement has some power. I remember the divestment movement that helped bring change to South Africa. We've got to divest in the banks that are funding the fossil fuel industry. Defund DAPA. All over this country, we've got to be engaged on these issues. And we've got to speak loudly and clearly that we have alternatives. Solar is an alternative. It's not some abstract 20-year in the future science fiction thing. China and Japan are eating our lunch on solar. And again, the voters in Florida, a purple state with a lot of red territory, had 2 referendums before them last year on solar. You need 60% vote to pass a referendum in Florida, and something like 70% voted for solar in August. And then the private utility industry put a fake solar initiative on the ballot for November. They were way ahead in the polls. Social media came alive, grassroots organizing came alive, and we beat back that fake amendment. We got to start thinking about referendums to ban fracking, for open primaries, for election integrity, to get rid of felony disenfranchisement. We've got to be, we all have to be standing up and working hard, whether you're a Democrat or a Green or an independent. Wherever your feet are, fight hard. We can change the Democratic Party, and we can grow a Green Party, and we can have a vibrant democracy, but it doesn't happen by sitting on our rear ends and being quiet. One of my favorite signs I saw in yesterday's rallies was "Take the path of most resistance." God bless you.